Good morning, everyone. This is Swati, and this is the Propel podcast. And I have with me today Bryan Hegadon. I will let him introduce himself in a minute, but we are going to discuss today the topic of net neutrality, which has been in the news, and Bryan is an expert on this. So, Bryan, welcome to the Propel podcast.
Thank you.
I'd love for you to just start by an introduction to yourself, please.
Sure. So, Bryan Hegadon, I've been in the telecom industry for, the better part of 20 years now, mostly on the wireless side, but most recently on the US cable side.
Mhm.
And I've seen a lot of changes in terms of the demand on connectivity. In fact, it's growing exponentially even today. And so it's a very important conversation when you talk about government regulations and how the internet is utilized and how it's monetized today. So look forward to talking about it.
Thank you, Bryan. So let's dive right in. What is net neutrality? Tell us what it means, what the regulation was, why it's in place. Let's just start from there. Basics.
Yeah, there was concern that started over the last, I'll guess, say 10 years, where the network service providers might have too much control. So if you think about how important the internet became, here in the US, the federal government was very concerned that the network service providers could prioritize the traffic that favored their business model and deprioritize some of their competitors. So this all came about before streaming video became so popular. So if you think about television services, just literally 7 years ago, it was a linear TV broadcast being provided by your cable operators. And as other video options came available over the internet, without net neutrality rules, your cable operators could deprioritize the quality of service of their competitors and encourage consumers to want only their video content. As one example, so cable content was one of the red flags that those proponents for rules on net neutrality were created. And there were other business models too that, there was concern that they would be hampered if the cable industry could control the internet traffic without any kind of guardrails.
But today, and at that time, perhaps Netflix and the likes were small. But today, you mentioned to me before that Netflix is one of the largest consumers of the bandwidth, right?
That's correct.
So that landscape has changed in terms of,
Dramatically.
yeah.
In fact, during COVID, it isn't just entertainment video content, but also conversations like this. Two-way video conferencing for business is the way business is done now. So video now represents 91% of global
Oh,
internet traffic. That's
wow.
video. A
Okay.
lot of it is, TikTok videos and streaming, all kinds of user generated content, but also your in home video entertainment and television services are almost all IP now. They're all coming over and streaming over the internet. And when
And
you add them all together, that is the majority of the data traffic. So these content providers, I'll call them streaming content providers, have no financial relationship with the networks that deliver their services. Yet they charge consumers a subscription fee and they consume the majority of the bandwidth. So your network providers have the burden of constantly upgrading and spending massive amount of capital to upgrade their networks in order to maintain a good customer experience for receiving that content. So that's the argument that net neutrality now is being questioned. Is it hampering the network provider's ability to monetize the value of the transport, which is what they're responsible for? And is it actually tamping down innovation on network technology?
yeah. So, under the current kind of billing systems or business models, do people like Netflix pay anything to the internet service providers to use the bandwidth?
No,
No. So it's
nothing.
all on the consumers. So consumers pay the internet service providers and then they also get a subscription to Netflix, which incidentally consumes 40% of the bandwidth, you said. 40%. Okay. All right. And so let's come to the recent ruling. And so the recent ruling said what?
So the recent rulings were struck down. So now there are no net neutrality rules at this moment in time. So the cable operators and the network providers have the option to going to, say, Netflix and saying, listen, you're taking up the majority of the bandwidth. We're going to charge you based on the bandwidth, a usage-based model that you're consuming. Now, this is a really upside down financial model for the industry. And the first network provider to attempt to do this is going to get called out and probably lambasted publicly. How dare you? And there's enough competition today with cellular broadband providers, satellite broadband providers, fiber broadband providers. There is no monopoly anymore. The cable industry is no longer in control of their footprint like they were 15 years ago. So today there's enough competition that's going to self-regulate, essentially. You don't need government rules if free market economy is going to regulate bad behavior. So if Comcast were to decide to start charging the content providers an exorbitant usage fee, there would be a campaign against Comcast, and they would lose a lot of broadband subscribers accordingly. Because what Netflix would do is immediately pass that cost on to their Comcast customers only. And then people would switch off of Comcast because they didn't want to pay that extra fee. So it has to be done in a very methodical, slow manner to turn the value chain upside down. But what I actually thought when I first read this was this is an opportunity for, say, 15% of all internet users who don't subscribe to Netflix and other, high bandwidth services to no longer have to pay the same fee that their neighbors paying for who are hyper gamers and bandwidth consumers. So there's an opportunity here to have those benefit the most who use it the least.
And you were giving the example of your 8-year-old grandmom
Right.
who doesn't use gaming and who doesn't use Netflix, but still pays the same fee to the internet service provider as
That's
the
correct.
rest of us do, right? And
She pays $75 a month for internet, and all she's doing is email and downloading crossword puzzles.
yeah. Why is that? Why is she paying the same?
Because your internet service providers have no choice but to charge flat rates for internet. You can buy different tiers of speeds from your internet provider, but you really don't need to upgrade the way they're advertising. They're trying to convince you you need gigabit speeds. And unless you're a gamer that's concerned about latency, you really don't need to pay for these higher packages, but that's another conversation.
Yeah.
But the fact is, the internet service providers have to spend billions of dollars to upgrade their networks in order to keep up with this growing demand. The demand is growing on a hockey stick curve, and it's not going to let up. With AI, demand is going to only increase. And so the network providers need a way to monetize it. And I would argue that the subscription services, the streaming content providers, have a much healthier profit margin
Yes, of course. We
than
know
the
that.
network providers themselves.
Yeah, yeah. So your suggestion or your advocated business model is that the network provider goes and charges the content provider X amount of money because they're using that much bandwidth, and then the content provider will then still pass it on to the consumer, is it not?
Of course they will.
But what you're saying is now at least it will be more fair, or the charges will be more fairly distributed, in that the people that are subscribing to Netflix will pay the extra charges and those
Exactly
that are not.
right.
Okay, I get it. Thank you. But let's look at it from the other side, right? Let's say there's a startup that's coming up. And so looking at it from the perspective of small businesses, it was always the case that net neutrality was instituted so that internet service providers could not favor one content provider over the other, right? And let's say now, because Netflix uses 40% of the internet bandwidth, they do exercise a lot of influence over the internet service providers. Do you think that influence could be parlayed into blocking out new content service providers?
No, that can easily be prevented. There needs to be a transparent approach to these new business models. Let me correct you on one thing. Netflix traffic is 22%. of all
22%.
traffic, not 44,
Yes.
22%. But video traffic is now, above 90%.
Mm-hmm.
And then mobile data traffic is a huge number too. We can talk about that separately, but we'll hold on that. So going back to your point, with a very transparent approach to shifting this financial model, the charges would indeed be aligned to the usage all the way back to the consumer. So those consumers that are big gamers or big video consumers would end up paying more for their subscription services, but your internet costs would come down. Their total wallet spend for some will actually go up. And the total wallet spend for those that use very little of those bandwidth services could be free. So my thought process here, I won't say I'm an advocate for this, but I would say that I think there's an interesting opportunity in net neutrality being stricken down in that the objectives of digital divide and closing the digital divide and getting more people internet access could be funded with the commercial models themselves. We could actually see with a paradigm shift in the way the financial models work that the networks could be self-funded through collecting usage-based fees from these high-volume streaming content providers. And of course that gets passed on to the consumers that want to use that service, and those that don't should not have to burden the cost.
So you're saying potentially internet could be free for people as an infrastructure service, where it is
Yes,
paid for by the content guys
correct.
and they pass it on to their consumers, but ISPs, which is internet service providers, do not charge the consumers themselves. And so in other words, it could be free, especially for the people that don't use much of the content services. It could potentially be free. That's an interesting,
That's the point.
really interesting point. And
That
I
is the
think that's
point.
important. That's important.
And there's government funding out there to encourage build and internet connectivity to the unserved. And those programs over the years have attempted to encourage the ISPs to build into the rural markets and to, infill with different packages to the inner city. And, you know, some success. But it's been limited. And the challenge is it's extremely expensive to trench fiber out into rural lands when you only have a potential of maybe 5 farms to connect to it, right? And so there's been this, I'll say, healthy friction to do it. But on the other hand, a lot of smaller fiber builders are taking the government money. They're building out into the rural markets. They're covering those unserved. And then they're trying to sell their businesses back to the larger cable companies who are rolling up a lot of these smaller ones. Satellite has now, with Starlink being the best example, provided very competent broadband services to those rural markets. So the need to trench fiber really isn't there. You can get an excellent broadband experience in a low density market now with satellite. So that helps. But back into the higher density areas, a lot of the unserved in inner cities has nothing to do with can they get internet, it's affordability. And that's why this model could fund affordability for the lower economic segment that they care about connecting. And it's important that they have access for learning, jobs, and information.
So again, let me look at it from the perspective of startups for a minute. I mean, we have all this going on with TikTok where, you never know, it may potentially be banned. There may be other services that come in to fill that gap, but they may be much smaller. And of course, there'll be eventually replacements for TikTok and so on as well, because that cycle always keeps moving. So the question is, if in fact there are such large customers for an internet service provider and that there's a single customer who's paying 20% of their bills and there's others that are paying smaller amounts, would it not be detrimental to the small companies that are trying to start up in this environment?
I don't see that because, frankly, if you are a small provider of a streaming service, your usage is nil, and therefore the cost for usage would not apply. And the ISPs could have a tiered structure for usage-based charges that don't even come into play until you get to a critical point of bandwidth need. So startups have such a low bandwidth requirement, there wouldn't even be a charge between the ISP and a startup. And
Yeah.
then quality of service would become very important.
Yeah.
in controlling quality of service goes back to this transparency point. The ISPs have to be very transparent about what level of service they're providing to each.
Do you think there should be regulation around quality of service? That you cannot deny quality of service, given assuming that your customers are paying what they need to pay? Because my best guess is someone like someone like Netflix, not the studios themselves, but it's a big studio now. Someone like Netflix, someone like Amazon Prime would have an interest in wiping out competition before it starts. Wouldn't that be the case? And so they could do it in many different ways, including having an internet service provider not provide the same level of service below a certain level of payment. I mean, this is a little hypothetical, but just trying to brainstorm here. Do you think there should be regulation around equality of quality of service?
I think that is definitely an issue worth highlighting. Yes. I do think quality of service needs to be on par for any service provider. I think consumers will demand that. I think that the only lever you have against the massive bandwidth consumers, I hate to keep using Netflix, it's just the best example by a large margin. The only lever you have, frankly, is literally if you don't pay, then you're the one that gets dinged. Not that you get something better than everyone else if you do pay. So it's kind of using the stick versus the carrot with the usage-based model.
So, got it. So, what we're saying here is although net neutrality came about because at that time, people like Netflix were the small guys and the internet service providers were the big content providers. And so,
That's right.
Right? So, at
That's
that
correct.
time, the rules around net neutrality came about so that the internet service providers could not block out the Netflixes of the world, which was small at that time, right? So that was the intent. But now the landscape has evolved such that these guys, the Netflixes of the world, are now the big gorillas,
That's
which
right.
is great, which is how it was supposed to be. That was the intent of the regulation, to enable these startups to grow. But now they are influencing the landscape in a different way, in that they're consuming all of the bandwidth, but they're not paying anything for it. So now and in the meanwhile, the content services of the ISPs have diminished to almost zero, right?
Right.
So
That's
now
true.
there's a need for another kind of regulation, which is a usage based regulation. What has so far happened is that the existing net neutrality rules have been struck down. However, I'm not sure that this quality of service is being required or mandated under the current regime. That's correct, right?
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. So how do
It's
you
been a
answer?
week. I mean, I think there is nobody's going to just pull out a hammer and start turning the financial equation upside down in the industry.
Correct.
They will be destroyed in the marketplace.
Yeah.
A free market economy has its own ability to regulate. And with all the competition that's available everywhere, I find it hard to believe that, Comcast could come out and immediately demand, excessive fees against anyone using or selling services over their network. They will be lambasted. They will definitely suffer. The first one out will suffer the most. So it needs to be a toe in the water approach, a very slow, methodical approach to start charging usage fees, and only at the highest bandwidth equations, in such a way that it's pennies initially, and the pass through to consumers from those streaming service providers will be very minimal, and it won't be very disruptive at first, but then it'll start to grow as the opportunity for network innovation can be funded. So if you think about, all these technologies around the network to improve the customer experience and reduce the amount of bandwidth aren't being invested in by the network providers. But if you think about content distribution partnerships, think about compression technologies, if I'm Netflix and I'm being charged for bandwidth usage, I'm going to go out of my way to work with content distribution partners that move my content to the very edge where consumers are pulling it, so I'm not sending it inefficiently, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm also going to really invest in compression technologies. So all these things are really going to benefit the consumers at the end of the day, and the total cost to the consumer may not be as impactful as we presume.
So there's two things that come up in what you just said. One of which content distribution services I want to discuss in a moment. But before we go there, I want to understand. So you're saying it's going to be a slow and steady kind of uptick in prices, which are then passed on to the consumers of, let's say, Netflix. I mean, we keep talking about Netflix here, but content service providers, and they are
Sure.
the big guys, right? Um, since you're saying that the first one out the door is going to really be kicked, would it make sense for them to get together? Would it be collusion in that case? And how do
Yeah,
you see that?
somebody will throw the first shot at some point, but that's why I think it'll be a minor
Yeah.
charge. I don't think it'll be anything too disruptive.
Okay.
And I do think partnerships could benefit the streaming content providers. For instance, Netflix could find startups coming to them to utilize their delivery schemes, the way they compress technology and deliver it through CDNs at the edge. They could partner with that model. Netflix could find new revenue streams. And by the way, Netflix being able to charge consumers more because of this paradigm shift will benefit Netflix balance sheets at the top line. Now, sure, their costs will go up too, but I think what they'll find is their profit dollars could actually increase if they manage it well. Again, if you're allowed to charge consumers on different tiered models based on usage, then there's new paradigms in their financial balance sheet as well. Obviously, the network service providers will have a new balance sheet. They'll have new revenues coming from all the streaming content providers, but they'll have less revenues coming from their connected customers. And so they need to balance that because they don't want to lose a relationship with households, businesses.
Yeah.
So the relationship with households will change and it'll be a more enabling relationship as opposed to a financial one. It won't be about billing. It'll be about how do we connect all the things in your home? How do we provide you with your own smart home environment and control your physical security devices and your digital speakers and all these things will be, the conversation they'll start having with consumers more than they do today instead of your bill for internet.
Yes. So it's value-added services
That's
above,
right. That's
above
right.
and beyond. Well,
And the Wi-Fi networks become a very important network layer for everyone because our experiences, let's face it, are with our Wi-Fi equipment. And they, of course, have to be connected to the internet. But like right now, you and I are probably both doing this video stream over Wi-Fi, correct?
yes, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Wi-Fi networks and the evolution of Wi-Fi technology is the most important. It is the last feat of the connectivity experience.
Yeah. So I did have some other topics to talk about. Well, I think we're about at the end of our time. And before we kind of end, I just want to summarize my key takeaways, right? So one of the most interesting things that you said was how, in your view of the world, internet could hypothetically be free, especially for the lowest level of users, right? People who use the
Correct.
least amount of internet. I think that is super important because with striking down of net neutrality, everyone assumes that, oh, it's going to be bad for the small guys. But what you're saying is no, it could in fact lead to free internet and bridge the digital divide. So that's interesting. But all of that also remains to be played out. I mean, that's the other thing I take away is that you think there's going to be new business models. And I think this whole ruling came in the first week of January when we connected. I read your article and we connected. But thereafter, it's just been 2 weeks. And so it's going to take some time to play out. And so it remains to be seen what happens. But interestingly, our view after this discussion seems to be that it's not all that bad for the small guys, striking down the net neutrality regulations. Although everyone seems to think, oh, there's few people, let's just say there's case to be made on either side.
There
But
is.
it's important that we at least bring to the fore what the various opinions are. So, Brian, thank you so much for being with us, and hope to have you again soon when we're going to discuss content distribution, maybe.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian.
All right. Cheers.